No one expected the girl they laughed at to become the only person the Duke would cross a crowded hall to defend. The first whisper reached Clara Whitmore before the silver tray had finished trembling in her hands. It was soft, polished, and cruel, the sort of whisper ladies used when they wished to wound without wrinkling their gloves. Clara stood beneath the chandelier of Ashbourne Hall, where 100 candles burned above polished marble and dark oak, turning every crystal glass into a small, judging eye. She was 24, fair-skinned, bright-cheeked, beautifully full-figured, and dressed in the plain gray gown of the household staff, though no plain cloth could quite dim the lively warmth in her face or the quick intelligence in her blue eyes. Her brown curls, pinned hastily beneath a white cap, had escaped in soft rings at her temples, and despite the ache in her arms from carrying the heavy tea service, she moved with the natural grace of someone who had learned to smile while the world measured her too harshly. "Careful," murmured Lady Evelyn Hart from beside the fireplace, her pale fan opening like a blade. "One more cake on that tray, and the poor thing may be tempted to keep it for herself." A few guests laughed, not loudly enough to seem vulgar, only loudly enough to make certain Clara heard. She kept her chin level. She had learned long ago that tears gave cruel people proof of victory. Ashbourne Hall was not a kind house, but it was a magnificent one, with stone walls that held the winter chill even in spring, tall windows veiled in rain, and portraits of dead dukes staring down as if disappointment were part of the family inheritance. At the far end of the great hall, half hidden by the shadow of the upper gallery, Duke Nathaniel Ashbourne stood alone. He had not invited most of the guests. Society had simply forced itself through his doors in the name of duty, alliances, and old blood. He watched the room with the stillness of a man who had forgotten how to belong inside one. At 36, Nathaniel was handsome in a severe, unsettling way, his black hair touched faintly with silver at the temples, his face pale from years spent away from sunlight and laughter, his gray eyes as cold as the rain sliding down the windows. They called him the Winter Duke because he had not smiled in 6 years, not since betrayal had hollowed his family name and grief had locked every warm room in his heart. Clara did not look up at him. Servants were not meant to notice dukes unless summoned, and girls like Clara were expected to take up as little space as possible, though life had given her a body made of softness, color, and impossible presence. She crossed the hall to offer tea to an elderly baroness whose diamonds shook with each breath. Another guest shifted his chair without warning, forcing Clara to stop sharply. The tray tilted, porcelain rattled. A spoon slipped, spun once against the silver, and fell to the marble with a bright, humiliating sound. Silence opened around her. Then came Lady Evelyn's voice again, sweeter than sugared poison. Perhaps the kitchen stairs would be safer for someone of her proportions. Clara bent to retrieve the spoon. Her cheeks warmed, but her mouth curved, not in surrender, but in that stubborn little smile she wore when refusing to let pain make her ugly. "The kitchen stairs are quite safe, my lady," she said gently, placing the spoon back on the tray. "It is the drawing room that seems dangerous tonight." A shocked breath passed through the guests. Clara realized too late that she had spoken aloud. Lady Evelyn's smile vanished. The Baroness lowered her cup. Somewhere above them, the Duke's gloved hand tightened on the carved railing. Clara curtsied at once, her heart beating hard beneath her modest bodice, not from fear of punishment alone, but from the terrible knowledge that one honest sentence could cost a poor woman her place. "Forgive me," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I meant no disrespect." "No," came a deep voice from the gallery, cold enough to still every candle flame. Duke Nathaniel Ashbourne descended the stairs slowly, each step sounding against the stone like a verdict. The guests turned, startled by the rare movement of a man they had spent the evening pretending not to fear. Clara kept her eyes lowered, fingers tight around the tray handles. She expected dismissal. She expected shame. Instead, the Duke stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could see a faint tremor in his right hand before he closed it into a fist. His gaze moved from Clara's flushed face to the laughing mouths around the room, and something in his expression hardened into quiet anger. "You meant no disrespect, Miss Whitmore," he said. "You merely answered it." The room fell utterly silent. Clara looked up before she could stop herself. For one breath, her eyes met his, and she saw not warmth, not yet, but recognition, sharp and unwilling, as if her small act of courage had struck a door inside him that had not been opened for years. Nathaniel looked away first, but not before Clara saw the shadow behind his coldness, the wound beneath the title, the loneliness standing beside him like an old companion. Then he turned to the room and said, with perfect control, "Ashbourne Hall has endured many unpleasant sounds. Mockery will not become one of them." No one laughed after that. Clara carried the tray back toward the servants' passage with her head a little higher than before, though her hands still trembled. Behind her, the Duke remained beneath the chandelier, surrounded by guests and yet completely alone. He told himself he had defended order, not her. He told himself her eyes meant nothing. But long after the hall filled again with cautious conversation, Nathaniel Ashbourne could still see the brave curve of Clara Whitmore's smile, and for the first time in 6 years, the cold inside him shifted. By midnight, every guest in Ashbourne Hall knew Clara Whitmore's name, though most of them spoke it as if it were a stain on the linen. She heard it in the corridor outside the kitchens, in the pause before a door closed, in the little hush that followed her footsteps. Miss Whitmore, the girl who answered Lady Evelyn, the girl the Duke defended, the girl who forgot her place. Clara said nothing. She only unpinned her white cap, shook loose the soft brown curls that had been aching against their pins, and stood before the small cracked mirror in the servants' washroom, where the candlelight made her cheeks look rosier than she felt. She was still the same Clara she had been that morning, full-figured, lively-eyed, too warm for the cold house around her, with flour dust on one sleeve and a faint bruise of weariness beneath her smile. Yet something had changed. Not in the world. The world had remained exactly as cruel as expected. The change was inside her, small as a match struck in darkness. For one forbidden moment, someone powerful had seen the insult and named it for what it was. Clara pressed her fingertips to the edge of the wash basin and let out a quiet breath. "Do not be foolish," she whispered to her reflection. "Dukes defend their houses, not kitchen girls." Still, she could not forget the way Duke Nathaniel Ashbourne had looked at her, not with pity, not with amusement, but with a troubled recognition that had followed her like the scent of rain. The next morning, Ashbourne Hall woke beneath a sky the color of pewter. Rain swept over the estate in long silver lines, turning the gravel drive dark and shining, while the old windows trembled in their frames. Clara was sent to the East Library with fresh coal, clean towels, and strict instructions not to touch anything on the Duke's writing desk. The East Library had been closed for years except to Nathaniel himself. Even the housekeeper, Mrs. Bell, lowered her voice when speaking of it. Clara pushed the heavy door open with her hip and stepped into a room that seemed to be holding its breath. Dark shelves climbed nearly to the ceiling. Velvet curtains blocked most of the gray daylight. The air smelled of leather, cold ash, and paper that had outlived its owner. On the mantel stood a small portrait of a woman with kind eyes, half hidden behind a stopped brass clock. Clara knew at once it must have been the Duke's mother, not because anyone had told her, but because grief has a way of arranging a room around itself. She set the coal beside the hearth and knelt to rebuild the fire, humming under her breath before she remembered where she was. The tune had belonged to her father, a merry little song he used to whistle in their bookshop before sickness and debt carried him out of her life. Back then, she had been Miss Clara Whitmore, of Whitmore and Son Booksellers, a girl with ink on her fingers, sugar cakes in her pockets, and so much laughter that customers lingered just to hear it. After his death, her uncle had arrived with legal papers, solemn eyes, and a false kindness that had turned every shelf, every chair, every treasured thing into someone else's property. Clara had been told there were debts. She had been told good girls accepted their burdens quietly. By winter, she was no longer a bookseller's daughter. She was a servant with 2 dresses, 3 coins, and a body people believed gave them permission to make jokes. The fire caught suddenly, gold light licking along the wood. Clara smiled despite herself. "There you are," she murmured. "Even cold things remember how to burn. Do they?" The voice came from behind her. Clara rose so quickly that her skirt brushed the coal scuttle. Duke Nathaniel stood in the doorway, dressed in black as always, one gloved hand resting on the frame. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes moved from the newly lit fire to the portrait on the mantel, and for an instant the stern line of his mouth faltered. "Your Grace," Clara said, curtsying at once. "I was told to prepare the room before breakfast. I did not know you would come so early." "This is my library," he replied. "I come when I wish." "Of course." She lowered her eyes, though not as low as she might have yesterday. A pause settled between them, filled by rain and the soft crackle of kindling. Nathaniel walked to the desk, then stopped. The brass clock on the mantel had been turned slightly, no longer hidden in shadow. Clara noticed his gaze and stepped forward in alarm. "Forgive me. I only moved it to dust beneath it. I should not have touched it." His hand lifted, then lowered. "My mother kept that clock beside her bed." Clara's expression softened, not with pity, but with reverence. "Then it should not have been left where the dark could swallow it." The words were too honest. She knew at the moment they left her mouth. Nathaniel looked at her sharply. Any other servant would have apologized again. Clara did not. She only stood there, beautiful in her plainness, round and bright, and unguarded, with firelight warming the soft curve of her cheek. At last, the Duke looked back at the clock. "You speak as if darkness is a thing that can be argued with." Clara gathered the towels into her arms. "No, Your Grace. Only as if it should not always be allowed to win." For a long moment, Nathaniel said nothing. Then he turned toward the rain-streaked window, dismissing her without a word. Clara left quietly, believing the conversation finished. But behind her, in the dim library, the Winter Duke stood beside the small revived fire and listened to the brass clock begin to tick again. The ticking clock in the East Library became the first sound in Ashbourne Hall that Nathaniel did not resent. For 3 days after Clara Whitmore turned it toward the light, the small brass hands moved with patient certainty above the mantel, measuring hours he had once preferred to lose. He told himself he noticed only because silence had grown too deep in that room. He told himself the girl had merely dusted a forgotten object, nothing more. Yet each morning, when he entered before sunrise, there was evidence of her presence arranged with quiet care. The fire had been coaxed to life without smoke. The curtains had been opened exactly 6 inches, enough for gray daylight to touch the floor, but not enough to expose the room to the world. His books, which most servants feared to touch, remained precisely where he had left them, except for one volume on the lower shelf that had been repaired with a narrow strip of linen. It was an old atlas, cracked along the spine, a book his mother had once used to show him oceans he had never crossed. Nathaniel held it in his hands longer than necessary, his gloved thumb resting over the neat repair. No one had asked Clara to mend it. No one had even noticed it was broken. That was what disturbed him most. Clara noticed things. Not loudly. Not with the vanity of those who wish to be praised for kindness. She noticed the loose button on the footman's coat, the trembling hands of the elderly maid who carried water too heavy for her, the way the smallest kitchen boy stood near the door because he was always cold. She moved through the house like a small bright flame, soft in shape, quick in spirit, beautiful in a way society had trained itself not to honor. Her laughter, when it escaped in the servants' corridor, was warm and unpolished, like sunlight falling through a bakery window. Nathaniel heard it once from the landing and stopped so suddenly that his steward nearly walked into him. "Your Grace?" Mr. Alden asked. "Nothing," Nathaniel said, and continued on, though the sound followed him into the study like an unwelcome memory of spring. On the 4th afternoon, rain turned to sleet, striking the glass with tiny silver taps. Nathaniel had remained in the East Library longer than intended, reviewing estate accounts he could not force himself to read. A thin headache pressed behind his eyes. Beyond the door, he heard footsteps, then Clara's voice, cheerful but lowered. "There now, Samuel. Hold still, or this will look like a sailor tided in a storm." Nathaniel looked up. Through the narrow opening of the library door, he saw Clara kneeling in the corridor before the young kitchen boy, fastening a blue scarf around his neck. The boy could not have been more than 10. His sleeves were too short, his cheeks red from the cold, and his eyes shone with the shy devotion children reserve for the first adult who treats them gently. Clara's own shawl had slipped from one round shoulder, and her plain gown was dusted with flour at the waist. She looked entirely out of place near the carved paneling and ancestral portraits, and somehow more alive than anything in the house. "Miss Clara," Samuel whispered. "Mrs. Pike said I am too clumsy to serve upstairs." Clara tucked the scarf ends neatly into his coat. "Then we shall make your clumsiness very elegant. Walk slowly. Breathe first." People drop things most often when they are afraid. Are you ever afraid? Clara smiled, and the smile held secrets Nathaniel understood too well. Every day, I simply refuse to let fear have the best chair in the room. Samuel grinned. Nathaniel stepped back before they could see him, unsettled by the strange tightness in his chest. He had heard sermons on courage, speeches in Parliament, declarations from officers and noblemen who mistook pride for strength. None had sounded as true as Clara Whitmore kneeling in a cold corridor, tying a scarf for a frightened boy. That evening, the household prepared for Lady Evelyn Hart's return. She arrived with 2 companions, 3 trunks, and the confidence of a woman who believed every room improved when it feared her opinion. Nathaniel received her in the drawing room with formal indifference. She spoke of charity committees, winter concerts, and the necessity of preserving standards among servants. Then Clara entered with the tea tray. Her cheeks were bright from the kitchen heat, her figure soft and lovely beneath the gray dress, her eyes lively despite the caution that touched them when she saw Evelyn. Lady Evelyn's gaze moved over her with delicate contempt. "Ah," she said, "the outspoken one." Clara curtsied. "Good evening, my lady." Nathaniel watched Clara's hands. They were steady. He watched Evelyn smile. It was not. Something in him, long buried beneath frost and discipline, sharpened like a blade drawn silently from velvet. He did not yet know why Clara Whitmore's dignity mattered to him. He only knew that it did, and that the next person who tried to make her bow from shame would find Ashbourne Hall far less hospitable than before. Lady Evelyn Hart did not raise her voice when she wished to injure someone. She had been raised among polished tables, silver spoons, and drawing rooms where cruelty wore pearls, so she understood that the sharpest insults sounded almost like compliments. At breakfast the following morning, while rain swept against the tall windows of Ashbourne Hall and the fire hissed low in the marble hearth, she watched Clara Whitmore refill the coffee cups with a smile that never reached her eyes. "You are surprisingly light on your feet, Miss Whitmore," Evelyn said, touching one gloved finger to the rim of her cup. "I confess, I expected more noise." One of her companions hid a laugh behind a napkin. Clara's cheeks warmed, but her hands remained steady. She looked especially pretty that morning, though no one in the room would have been generous enough to say it aloud. Her brown curls were pinned neatly. Beneath her cap, her fair face bright from the kitchen heat, and her full, graceful figure moved with an energy that made the cold dining room seem less severe. "My father used to say a person should only make noise when the truth requires it, my lady," Clara replied gently. "Coffee rarely does." The laugh that followed came from Samuel, the young kitchen boy, who had been standing by the sideboard with a basket of rolls. He silenced himself at once, eyes wide with fear, but Lady Evelyn had already turned. "How charming," she said. "The servants are forming a little theater." Clara placed the coffee pot down. Samuel meant no disrespect. "Did I ask you to answer for him?" Evelyn's gaze returned to Clara, smooth and pale. "You do seem eager to stand in front of every unfortunate thing in this house." The room stilled. At the head of the table, Duke Nathaniel Ashbourne lowered his newspaper. He had not spoken through most of the meal, but his attention had been fixed with dangerous quiet upon the scene unfolding before him. Clara felt it without looking. She could not allow herself to look. If she did, she feared she might find strength there, and strength borrowed from a duke was a dangerous thing for a woman with nowhere else to go. "Forgive me, my lady," Clara said. "I only meant that the boy is young." "And you are what, Miss Whitmore?" "His champion." Evelyn smiled. "How noble. How touching. How very suitable for someone who has no proper place of her own." The words landed softly, but Clara felt them with terrible precision. No proper place. That had been the sentence written over her life since her father's death. Not in the bookshop that had once smelled of ink and cinnamon. Not in the house her uncle sold from beneath her. Not among ladies, because she had no fortune. Not among servants, because she still spoke like a girl who had once read poetry aloud beside a shop window. And not in any room where her body entered before her name, giving strangers permission to decide what she deserved. For one moment, her smile flickered. Nathaniel saw it. He saw the tiny fracture at the corner of her mouth, the brave lift of her chin, the way her fingers tightened around the folded napkin until the linen creased. It was nothing. It was everything. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice cut through the room, not loud, but absolute. Clara turned at once. Yes, Your Grace. You will attend the East Library after breakfast. Lady Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Clara's heart sank, though she curtsied. As you wish. An hour later, she entered the library with the certainty that she would be dismissed. The fire was already burning. The brass clock ticked on the mantel. Nathaniel stood before his mother's portrait, his hands clasped behind his back, a tall black figure shaped by restraint. Close the door, he said. Clara obeyed. If this concerns breakfast, Your Grace, I apologize for speaking out of turn. Stop apologizing for having a spine. She blinked. He turned then, and the coldness in his face had shifted into something more difficult to bear. Not softness. Not quite. Recognition. Lady Evelyn has mistaken refinement for permission, he said. That error will not be encouraged in my house. Clara looked down at her hands. Ladies like her are rarely corrected for speaking as they please. Then she is overdue for the experience. A small, unwilling smile touched Clara's mouth before she could hide it. Nathaniel noticed, and the room seemed warmer for half a second. Then a sharp crack sounded from the hallway, followed by a maid's cry of alarm. Clara turned and hurried out before remembering she had not been dismissed. Nathaniel followed. At the end of the corridor, thin smoke curled beneath the door of a neglected sitting room where a candle had been left too close to old drapery. There was no flame spreading, only smoke, heat, and confusion as servants rushed uncertainly with water pails. Stand back, Nathaniel commanded. But Clara had already seen what sat on the small writing table inside. A carved wooden box, dark with age, placed directly beneath the smoking curtain. She had dusted around it before. She knew the Duke never allowed it to be moved. Before anyone could stop her, she crossed the threshold, lifted the box carefully with both hands, and carried it into the corridor. The smoke made her cough, in one corner of. The box was warm enough to sting her palm, but she held it as if it were a sleeping child. Nathaniel took one step toward her, all composure stripped from his face. Why would you touch that? Clara looked up, startled by the pain in his voice. Because it mattered. He stared at the box. Inside it, beneath the little brass clasp, lay his mother's pocket watch, her final letter, and the pressed white rose from the last morning she had walked in the garden. Clara did not know those details. She only knew that grief had weight, and the box had been heavy with it. You could have called someone, he said, more harshly than he intended. Clara's palm throbbed, but her voice stayed calm. Some things should not be left to wait for permission. Nathaniel looked from her reddened hand to her face, bright and breathless and stubbornly alive in the dim corridor. For the first time in years, fear moved through him, sudden and unwelcome, not for himself, not for his name, not for the dead, but for the warm-hearted girl standing before him, as if saving another person's sorrow were the most natural thing in the world. The wooden box remained on the East Library table for the rest of the afternoon, untouched except by the Duke's eyes. Nathaniel had sent for Mrs. Bell the moment he saw the red mark across Clara's palm, and though Clara insisted it was nothing more than a small sting, he ordered a basin of cool water, clean linen, and a jar of lavender salve as if the entire household depended upon her hand being properly tended. Clara sat near the fire with her sleeve rolled just above the wrist, looking both grateful and embarrassed. Her full cheeks flushed a soft rose beneath the loose curls escaping her cap. She was not accustomed to being cared for. She was accustomed to carrying, mending, lifting, smiling, soothing, and stepping aside. To sit while others fussed over her felt almost improper. Nathaniel stood by the mantel, severe and silent, watching Mrs. Bell wrap the linen around Clara's palm. It is a very small burn, Your Grace, Clara said at last, trying to brighten the room with a smile. I have had worse from a pie dish. Mrs. Bell clicked her tongue. A pie dish does not belong to the late Duchess of Ashbourne. Clara's smile faded as she looked toward the carved box. Then I am very glad I reached it in time. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. You should not have risked yourself for an object. Clara looked at him gently. It was not only an object. The room seemed to narrow around those words. Mrs. Bell lowered her gaze and busied herself with the linen. Outside, rain dragged cold fingers down the window glass. Nathaniel turned away, but not before Clara saw grief move across his face, brief and unguarded, like a candle flame exposed by an opening door. When Mrs. Bell left, silence settled between them with the weight of old velvet. Clara rose carefully. I should return to the kitchen. Sit. The word came too quickly, too sharply. Nathaniel closed his eyes for a moment, then softened his voice by the smallest degree. Please. Clara sat. That single word, spoken like a man unfamiliar with asking, changed the air more than any apology could have done. Nathaniel opened the wooden box with a key from his watch chain. Inside lay a silver pocket watch, a folded letter, and a dried white rose pressed between two thin pieces of glass. Clara did not lean closer. She did not ask questions. She only waited, giving his sorrow the dignity of not being crowded. My mother carried this watch during the last winter she lived, Nathaniel said. His voice was low, almost unused. She believed time was not something to conquer, but something to cherish before it left. Clara's eyes softened. She sounds wise. She was kind. He paused. Too kind for this family. The fire snapped softly. Clara held her bandaged hand in her lap. Kindness is not weakness, Your Grace. It is often the only strength that does not make others afraid. Nathaniel looked at her then, really looked, at the lively blue eyes that refused bitterness, at the pretty round face that still found room for warmth after years of being judged, at the soft, beautiful shape of her, so often mocked by fools who mistook delicacy for worth. She was not delicate. She was something far rarer. She was whole in places where the world had tried to make her ashamed. You speak as if you have had to defend kindness before, he said. Clara's smile returned, smaller now. Many times. From whom? People who believed pain gave them permission to pass it on. Nathaniel understood that answer too well. He had passed his pain into the walls of Ashbourne Hall, into locked rooms and unanswered letters, into every cold silence that had made his servants walk carefully and his guests whisper. He had called it discipline. He had called it dignity. Perhaps it had only been grief wearing a noble coat. From beyond the library door came a burst of laughter from Lady Evelyn and her companions as they passed down the corridor. Clara lowered her eyes at once, the old instinct returning. Nathaniel saw it and felt something inside him rebel. Do not do that, he said. Clara looked up. Do what? Disappear before they even enter. Her breath caught. For a moment, the lively mask slipped, revealing the tired young woman beneath it, the bookseller's daughter turned servant, the beautiful full-figured girl who had learned to make herself smaller in rooms too narrow for her spirit. Sometimes disappearing is safer, she whispered. Nathaniel closed the box and stepped away from the mantel. He did not touch her. He did not need to. His voice, when it came, held the quiet force of a vow he did not yet know he was making. Not in my house. Clara stared at him, unable to answer. Outside the library, Lady Evelyn's laughter faded down the hall. Inside, the brass clock ticked steadily, the fire burned brighter, and Nathaniel Ashbourne realized with unsettling clarity that the warmth returning to his home had a name. By the time evening settled over Ashbourne Hall, the rain had stopped, leaving the estate wrapped in a pale mist that clung to the gardens and silvered the black branches beyond the windows. Clara Whitmore should have been in the kitchens helping Mrs. Pike prepare the late supper trays, but Mrs. Bell had sent her to the old conservatory with a basket of folded linens and a warning to rest her hand whenever it ached. Clara promised she would, though promises made to housekeepers were easier than promises made to oneself. She moved through the glass-walled room with her usual brisk warmth, humming softly as she placed fresh cloths over the wicker chairs and brushed dead leaves from the little tables. The conservatory had once been beautiful. Even neglected, it held the memory of beauty in its ironwork, its cracked blue tiles, and its rows of sleeping roses waiting for a gentler season. Clara liked it there. The plants did not care that she was full-figured, that her cheeks dimpled when she smiled, that her waist did not fit the narrow fashions praised in drawing rooms. Plants cared for water, light, patience, and hands willing to tend them after everyone else had forgotten. You are speaking to the roses now? Clara turned, startled, a folded linen pressed against her bandaged palm. Duke Nathaniel stood just inside the doorway, his dark coat unbuttoned, his face half-shadowed by the last gray light. He should have looked severe among the pale leaves and misted glass, but something about the conservatory softened the edges of him. Only encouraging them, Your Grace, Clara said. They seem undecided about surviving the winter. Most things are. Clara tilted her head, a lively spark returning to her eyes. Then they require stubborn company. Nathaniel almost answered, but the faintest sound from the corridor made him look back. Lady Evelyn's voice drifted near, followed by the lighter voices of her companions. Clara's expression changed at once. Not dramatically. That was the tragedy of it. The smile did not vanish. It simply learned to defend itself. Nathaniel saw the transformation and disliked it more than he wished to admit. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "why do you let her speak to you that way?" Clara folded the last cloth with careful precision. "Because she is a guest, and I am employed here." "That is not an answer." "It is the answer most women in my position are given." He stepped farther into the room. "And before this position?" The question came quietly, but it found the locked door of her past. Clara looked through the glass toward the wet garden, where the gravel paths glimmered under the mist. "Before this, I belonged to a bookshop in Boston. Whitmore and Son. It was small but warm. My father used to say every lonely person eventually found the right shelf." Her smile trembled, then steadied. "After he died, my uncle explained that warmth was not legal property. He sold the shop, settled debts I never saw proven, and arranged my employment here as if sending away an inconvenient parcel." Nathaniel's hand tightened at his side. "You did not contest it?" Clara gave a soft laugh, without bitterness. "With what money? What advocate? What name important enough to be believed? I was a young woman with $3, 2 trunks, and a figure my uncle said would make charity difficult." The words were spoken lightly, but Nathaniel heard the bruise beneath them. He imagined her in a bookshop, bright and laughing among paper and lamplight, before the world taught her to weigh every doorway before entering. The thought unsettled him in a place grief had not reached for years. "He was wrong," Nathaniel said. Clara looked at him. "About charity? About you being difficult to value?" For the first time, Clara had no ready answer. Color rose warmly in her cheeks, and she turned toward a rosebush to hide it, touching one curled leaf with the care of someone handling lace. In the corridor, Lady Evelyn appeared at the glass doors, pausing when she saw them together. Her face arranged itself into pleasant surprise, though her eyes sharpened immediately. "Your Grace," she said, stepping inside. "How unexpected to find you here. And with Miss Whitmore. How industrious she is, forever appearing in rooms where one would not expect her." Clara curtsied. "My lady." Evelyn's gaze fell to the bandage on Clara's hand. "Still displaying your little injury? How fortunate that some women can make even clumsiness memorable." Nathaniel's voice came before Clara could lower her eyes. "Miss Whitmore was injured preserving something precious to my family." Evelyn smiled. "How devoted." "No," he said. "Decent. There is a difference." The conservatory went still. Clara held her breath. Evelyn's smile hardened by one perfect degree. "You are generous, Your Grace." Nathaniel looked at Clara, then back to Evelyn. "Not nearly enough." Lady Evelyn understood then that the cold Duke, the silent Duke, the unreachable master of Ashbourne Hall, had begun to stand between Clara Whitmore and the world. She excused herself with polished grace, but her eyes left a promise behind. Clara watched her go, unease settling in her chest. Nathaniel saw it. "You are safe here," he said. Clara's answer was soft as the mist against the glass. Safety is rarely announced before it disappears. Nathaniel looked toward the darkening garden, and for the first time in 6 years, he wished Ashbourne Hall were not merely a fortress, but a home strong enough to keep one gentle heart from being wounded again. Lady Evelyn Hart waited until Ashbourne Hall was full of music before she set the trap. The winter supper had become an evening reception by sheer force of her will, with guests gathered beneath chandeliers, footmen carrying trays of spiced cider, and a string quartet playing softly from the corner of the drawing room. Rain had cleared from the windows, but the night outside remained black and glassy, pressing against the house like a witness. Clara Whitmore had been assigned to assist with the refreshments, and she moved through the room with practiced brightness, her bandaged hand hidden beneath a folded towel, her brown curls pinned with more care than usual, her fair cheeks warm from the kitchen fire. She looked lovely in the plain gray gown that everyone else insisted on seeing as a sign of her place. The dress could not hide the graceful fullness of her figure, the lively intelligence in her eyes, or the natural sweetness that made the younger servants straighten whenever she passed. Yet Clara felt the weight of every stare. Since the afternoon in the conservatory, Lady Evelyn's smile had sharpened into something patient and dangerous. Nathaniel stood near the mantel, speaking with an elderly judge about estate boundaries, but his attention moved through the room with exact precision. It found Clara when she entered. It followed the slight caution in her step. It paused at the towel covering her hand. Clara noticed, because some looks struck like insult and others arrived like shelter. She told herself not to depend on either. Near 9 o'clock, Lady Evelyn lifted a small velvet case from the table beside her chair and gave a graceful cry that silenced the nearest guests. "My emerald pin," she said, opening the case to reveal emptiness. "It was here not 10 minutes ago." Conversation thinned at once. The quartet faltered. Clara, who had just placed a tray of cups beside the sideboard, looked up with a sudden coldness in her chest. Lady Evelyn did not look at her immediately. That was how Clara knew. The accusation came dressed in hesitation, gloved, and perfumed. "I would never wish to suspect anyone unfairly," Evelyn said, her voice trembling just enough to gather sympathy. "But only the household staff have passed this table." One of her companions murmured something about vigilance. Another looked directly at Clara's covered hand. Heat rose up Clara's throat, but she stood very still. Mrs. Bell stepped forward, pale with alarm. "My lady, I am certain there has been some mistake." "I hope so," Evelyn replied. "The pin was my mother's." Sentiment makes one foolishly protective. Her eyes finally settled on Clara. "Miss Whitmore, perhaps you would not mind explaining why you were near this table shortly before it vanished." The room turned toward her. Clara felt the old sentence closing around her again. No proper place. No important name. No one required to believe her. Samuel stood near the door, his little face stricken. Clara saw him take half a step forward and shook her head almost imperceptibly. She would not let a child be pulled into this. "I placed cider cups on the sideboard, my lady," Clara said. Her voice was soft, but it carried. "I did not touch your table." "How fortunate that you remember so clearly. A clear conscience is helpful." The words brought a ripple of shocked breath. Lady Evelyn's eyes flashed. "Then you will not object if Mrs. Bell checks your apron pocket." Mrs. Bell looked horrified. Clara's fingers tightened around the tray. For one small second, the room blurred around its edges. She thought of her father's bookshop, of being believed when she said she had counted the drawer correctly, of warmth, of a name spoken with affection instead of suspicion. Then she set the tray down. "I object to being treated as guilty because I am convenient," she said. "But I have nothing to hide." Before Mrs. Bell could move, Nathaniel's voice entered the room like winter iron. "No one will search Miss Whitmore." Lady Evelyn turned with practiced hurt. "Your Grace, surely you understand the delicacy of the matter." Nathaniel crossed the room slowly. The guests parted for him. Clara kept her eyes forward, though her heart beat so hard she feared it might be heard above the music that had now fallen silent. Nathaniel stopped beside her, not in front of her, not shielding her as if she were helpless, but standing at her side as if the room would have to face them both. "I understand theft," he said. "I understand false concern. I also understand timing." Evelyn's face remained composed, but her fan stilled. "I do not know what you imply." "Then I shall be plain." Nathaniel looked toward the servants' entrance. "Samuel." The boy froze. Clara's breath caught. The Duke's voice softened by a fraction. "You will not be punished for telling the truth." Samuel swallowed, then stepped forward clutching his blue scarf. "I saw Lady Evelyn's maid near the flower stand, Your Grace. She put something behind the silver vase. I thought she was arranging the ivy." A murmur passed through the room. Evelyn's companion went pale. Nathaniel nodded to Mr. Alden, who crossed to the flower stand and lifted the vase. Beneath it, wrapped in a white handkerchief embroidered with the initials E.H., lay the emerald pin. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with every cruel word Lady Evelyn had ever spoken, returning to stand beside her. Clara closed her eyes for one breath, not in weakness, but in relief so deep it hurt. When she opened them, Nathaniel was looking at her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low enough that only those nearest heard its full weight. "Look at me." She did. "Did you take Lady Evelyn's pin?" "No, Your Grace. I believed you before the proof." Something in Clara's face trembled, then steadied into a dignity no accusation could touch. Nathaniel turned back to the room, and the coldness in him no longer seemed like absence, but command. "The shame tonight does not belong to Miss Whitmore." It belongs to anyone who mistook her kindness for weakness and her station for permission. Lady Evelyn's lips parted, but no answer came. Clara stood beneath the chandelier, full-figured, flushed, beautiful, and finally seen. And somewhere within the guarded ruin of Nathaniel Ashbourne's heart, another locked door opened. The emerald pin lay on the silver tray like a verdict no one wished to touch. Lady Evelyn Hart stood beneath the chandelier with every jewel on her throat suddenly looking less like ornament and more like evidence of a life spent being believed too easily. Her maid trembled near the doorway, pale and silent, while the guests who had smiled at Clara's humiliation now found great interest in their gloves, their glasses, and the polished floor. Nathaniel Ashbourne did not raise his voice. He had no need. The room had already bent beneath the weight of his silence. "Lady Evelyn," he said, "you and your party will leave Ashbourne Hall at first light." Evelyn's face tightened. "Your Grace, surely you do not intend to insult my family over a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding misplaces a glove. It does not hide a jewel beneath a vase and point suspicion at an innocent woman." The words were calm, but they cut cleanly through every excuse gathering in the room. Evelyn looked toward Clara, and for the first time, there was no sweetness in her expression, only disbelief. Clara stood beside the sideboard, her bandaged hand resting against her apron, her fair cheeks flushed, her full and lovely figure held with a stillness that cost her more courage than anyone knew. She did not look triumphant. That was what made Nathaniel's chest tighten. A crueler person might have enjoyed the reversal. Clara only looked tired, as if being proven innocent had not erased the pain of being suspected. "Miss Whitmore," Nathaniel said, turning toward her. "Come here." A murmur stirred at once. Clara's eyes widened. A servant did not cross a drawing room at a duke's command while half the county watched unless punishment, dismissal, or scandal waited on the other side. Yet his face held none of those things. She walked forward slowly, the gray skirt of her plain dress brushing the carpet, her curls soft around her temples, her blue eyes bright with uncertainty. Nathaniel met her halfway. That alone made the whispers stop. He did not force her to stand before him like a servant receiving judgment. He stood beside her again, equal in the eyes of the room if not by the laws of the world. "There is another matter to settle," he said. Mr. Alden, his steward, stepped forward with a leather folder. Clara recognized it vaguely as one that had arrived by messenger 2 days earlier, sealed in dark wax. Nathaniel took the papers, but did not open them at once. His gaze remained on Clara. "After the conversation in the conservatory, I asked my solicitor in Boston to review the records concerning Whitmore and Son booksellers." Clara's breath caught so sharply it seemed to hurt her. "Your Grace, your uncle claimed your father left debts sufficient to require the sale of the shop and your placement in service." Nathaniel opened the folder. Those debts were exaggerated, several signatures were improper, and one creditor listed in the documents appears never to have existed. The room faded around Clara. The chandelier, the guests, the silver cups, Lady Evelyn's rigid face, all blurred into a wash of candlelight. She saw instead a narrow shop window, her father's handwriting on brown paper labels, the little bell above the door, the smell of cinnamon, ink, and rain-damp coats. She saw the life taken from her not by fate, but by calculation. "No," she whispered, though she did not know whether she meant denial or grief. Nathaniel's voice softened. "The matter is already before the proper court. Until the estate is restored, I have placed funds in trust under your name. Your true name, Clara Whitmore of Whitmore and Son." Clara pressed her uninjured hand to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes, but she fought them with the same dignity she had fought every insult. "Why would you do this?" The question was so quiet that only those nearest could hear. Nathaniel looked at her as if the answer had become painfully simple. "Because someone should have done it when the world first asked you to disappear." No one moved. Even Lady Evelyn seemed frozen by the sight of a duke using his power not to possess, but to restore. Clara lowered her hand. Her face trembled, then steadied, and in that steadiness she became more beautiful than any polished lady in the room. Not because sorrow had made her delicate, but because it had failed to make her small. Nathaniel turned to the guests. "Miss Whitmore is no longer a member of my household staff. She remains in Ashbourne Hall tonight as my honored guest." The room received the words like thunder heard from far away. Clara looked at him, startled. Your Grace, I cannot accept such attention. You can, he said, but only if you choose it. That mattered. The choice. After years of being sent, assigned, judged, and placed, Clara was being asked. She looked around the room at the faces that had once measured her by her station, her body, her dress, her usefulness. Then she looked back at Nathaniel, whose cold gray eyes no longer seemed winter dead, but winter breaking. Slowly, she nodded. Nathaniel offered his hand, not as command, but invitation. Then let them see you stand where you were always worthy to stand. Clara placed her bandaged hand lightly over his sleeve, and together they crossed the drawing room. No music played. No one dared speak. Yet to Nathaniel, each step sounded like the reopening of a house long locked against sunlight. And to Clara, walking beside the man everyone feared, it felt not like rescue, but like return. Clara Whitmore left Ashbourne Hall before sunrise because dignity, once returned, felt too precious to risk beneath another roof. She did not flee in shame. She folded the borrowed shawl neatly at the foot of her bed, placed a note of thanks upon the small writing table, and walked through the servants' passage one final time while the house slept under a pale blue winter dawn. Her bandaged hand ached faintly. Her heart ached more. By morning, Lady Evelyn would be gone, the guests would whisper, and every drawing room from Boston to Newport would invent reasons why a duke had stood beside a full-figured former servant with too bright eyes and too little fortune. Clara knew how stories changed and polished. Mouths. Kindness became pity. Justice became scandal. A woman restored became a woman kept. She would not let Nathaniel Ashbourne's name become another thing people used to measure her worth. At the edge of the gravel drive, the old carriage house stood in mist, its lamps glowing amber through the gray. Clara had arranged for a hired wagon to take her as far as the village, 6 miles away, where she could wait for news from the court and decide what life looked like when it belonged to her again. She carried only one trunk. It felt strange that freedom could fit inside worn leather. Miss Whitmore. The voice came from behind her, low and unsteady in a way she had never heard before. Clara turned. Duke Nathaniel Ashbourne stood at the foot of the drive without hat or gloves, his black coat thrown over his shirt as if he had dressed in haste. The cold morning silvered his dark hair. His face, once carved from winter, was alive with something far more dangerous than anger. Fear. Your Grace, Clara said softly. I left a note. I read it. Then you understand. No, the word struck the mist between them. I understand accounts, land boundaries, old titles, false debts, and the 1,000 ways cowards hide cruelty inside proper language. I do not understand why the woman who taught my house to breathe again is standing in the cold with one trunk. Clara's smile trembled despite her effort to keep it calm. Because I will not be another burden placed on your name. Nathaniel stepped closer, then stopped, giving her space as carefully as one might hold a flame. You were never a burden. People will say you defended me because you pitied me. Let them say it. They will say I do not belong beside you. His eyes darkened. Then they have learned nothing. Clara looked away toward the road, where frost glittered along the hedges. All my life, people decided what room I was too large for, too poor for, too inconvenient for. Last night you gave me back my name. I cannot let that name disappear inside yours before I have learned how to carry it myself. Nathaniel was silent. For a moment, Clara feared she had wounded him. Then he reached into his coat and drew out the silver pocket watch from his mother's wooden box. He held it in both hands, not offering it quickly, but with reverence. My mother gave this to me on the day I became Duke. She told me power meant very little if it could not make one person safer than they had been before. Clara's eyes filled. I cannot take that. I am not giving it to you as a chain. His voice lowered. I am giving it to you as proof that I know the difference between love and possession. Go to the village if you must. Reopen your father's shop if the court restores it. Stand under your own sign, with your own key, in your own name. But do not leave believing that my heart chose you because you needed rescue. He placed the watch gently in her bandaged hand. It chose you because you brought warmth where I had made a religion of cold. Clara closed her fingers around the watch, and for the first time since her father's death, she allowed herself to weep without apology. Nathaniel did not reach for her tears. He simply stood with her in the dawn, patient and pale, as if the whole world could wait while she learned she was safe. Weeks passed before Ashbourne Hall opened its ballroom again. By then, the court had returned Whitmore and Son to Clara's name. Lady Evelyn had vanished into quieter circles, and Nathaniel had ordered every black covering removed from the portraits. On the night of the first winter gathering, Clara descended the stone staircase in a deep blue gown that honored every soft curve she had once been taught to hide. She was radiant, full-figured, beautiful, and alive with laughter that warmed the marble before she reached the last step. No one laughed at her. No one dared. Nathaniel waited below, not as a savior claiming what he had restored, but as a man humbled by the woman who had restored him. When Clara placed her hand in his, the brass clock in the East Library struck 9, steady and clear through the open doors. Some hearts do not melt for beauty alone. They melt for the one soul brave enough to bring warmth into their winter.